So good afternoon, everyone. We're short on time, so we're gonna dive right in. We've been dealing with two collusion narratives for the last 18 months or so. There's the famous one, the dastardly Trump-Russia collusion enterprise. And then there's a second one that hasn't gotten quite as much attention, and we're going to try to fix that this afternoon, which I would describe as the degree to which the Obama administration put the law enforcement and intelligence arms and apparatus of the government first in the service of the Clinton campaign, and then, failing that, to basically derail the president at the beginning of his administration. So the question, I guess, to start out with is, after 18 months, which collusion narrative do we think has more factual support? And why don't we start, Sarah, what do you think?
Oh, well, certainly after the last 18 months, the research, thank you, and the investigative work that we've been doing, what we've uncovered is such a heavy connection between, well, let's look at the dossier, for example. It was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the DNC. That was unearthed and uncovered. If you look back to the unmaskings and what we have now discovered and what some intelligence sources have described, the weaponization of our intelligence apparatus for political purposes, that still needs to be thoroughly investigated. But we saw the increase in unmaskings was exponential during the 2016, the year of 2016, the last year of President Obama's office.
So let's just to be clear, so we know what we're talking about on masking. What we mean is that the government collects this intelligence mainly through FISA programs, right? Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. They do surveillance on individuals, and they have bulk collection programs. That information gets refined into intelligence reporting, and when American citizens are identified because they've been incidentally collected,
correct,
their names are concealed.
That is absolutely correct. So their names are concealed. So then there has to be a request made to actually unmask the name, particularly if they're a civilian. If you're in the government, however, it may be that you're referred to as NSA 1 or American Politician 1, or they would give some kind of reference, so it would be easier to discern who you are if you're a government official. But the actual unmasking is the exposure of that American, and this is a very, very unusual process. It's not something that was done frequently prior to this, but the laws changed under President Obama, and that became more and more rampant, and especially during the last year. But back to your question, absolutely, the evidence is substantial on the part of, for me, at least for my research and the work that I've done and everything I've seen, is that the collusion narrative between Trump and Russia, we haven't seen any evidence of that. Neither Congress has been able to provide that, neither law enforcement has been able to provide that, but what we have is a number of instances where we've seen collusion between the Hillary Clinton camp, some members of the Democratic lawmakers, as well as the FBI and members of the intelligence apparatus that appear to have been colluding against the president, and then before the election when he was a candidate, and then after the election as an insurance policy.
Okay. Byron, the Trump-Russia investigation is really kind of a traditional investigation the way it's being conducted now, in the sense that you have prosecutors looking into it, they have subpoena power, they have other ways of collecting information. The sort of investigation of the investigators is very different, and it's being mainly conducted by congressional committees with the limitations that implies. Why is it so hard, do you think, particularly now that we're in a Republican administration and we have Republican congressional committees, to get to the bottom of things that mainly happened during a Democratic administration?
Well, this has driven some Republican investigators on Capitol Hill crazy because they think, wait a minute, we're on the same team. The Republican Trump appointees are running the Justice Department, they're running the FBI, then of course they should cooperate with us. And they're finding that it's just not the same, that there are bureaucratic imperatives that guide people at the Justice Department, regardless of who appointed them, and it's really difficult to get information. What you were talking about is basically you have 3 investigations going on Capitol Hill. You have the big mainstream bipartisan investigation with the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is doing the kind of classic investigation that you're seeing on CNN and MSNBC. Basically, you're seeing a very Trump-centered, sort of Russian-centered investigation. Then you have Devin Nunes, who you're going to hear from in a little bit, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee has taken a different tack. He's actually has looked at a number of contacts or Russia issues, but he's also done a lot of work on the dossier and what the Obama administration, the late Obama administration, did when they got the shock of their lives, which is the victory of Donald Trump. And the last one that don't forget that's made some noise also is the Senate Judiciary Committee run by Charles Grassley. It's a slightly more bipartisan effort than the House investigation, which is not bipartisan at all. And Grassley and Dianne Feinstein, the ranking Democrat, have done some things together, but anytime it gets really interesting, they split up. Right. And we have seen Grassley put out some very interesting information.
Yeah, in fact, Grassley, in combination, I think, with Lindsey Graham, who runs one of the subcommittees on the Judiciary Committee, actually put out a letter about Christopher Steele, yep. Who is the British spy who was responsible mainly for the Steele dossier that we now know was commissioned by the Clinton campaign. And I thought the interesting thing about that was, for all the hullabaloo over the Nunes memo, the Grassley-Graham letter actually corroborated the most important things that were in.
And it was completely independent. And Grassley's investigators came to this differently than Nunes' investigators did, and yet they came to the same conclusion.
Yeah. Chuck, what about the sort of deep state aspect of this? We know that to pry information, and this is the thing that I'm sure everybody finds the most frustrating. Again, we have a Republican administration, Republican-controlled committees, and they're trying to get information. And basically what Nunes essentially had to do was threaten them with contempt in order to pry some of the most important information out.
Right, yeah, it's been an interesting saga to watch unfold over the past, the dossier came out a little over a year ago, and it's pretty clear that the dossier is a significant part of the counterintelligence criminal investigation into possible collusion. And it's taken several months, starting last summer, before the Justice Department and FBI even started providing any sorts of documents to Nunes' committee. And it's kind of funny because Republicans on the Hill, Chuck Grassley and Nunes in particular, have really, they're asking questions that will provide more information. They are, I believe, on the side of transparency in all of this. But they're asking questions about the dossier that could potentially, it's hard to portray them as being partisan on that issue, because the questions they are asking could very well corroborate the dossier. But I mean, there's, as Sara said, we've seen no evidence at all to corroborate collusion. So yeah, the DOJ and FBI is pretty clear. It has stonewalled on a lot of these document productions. And that, December is when they really started producing these documents, and then now the memos came out. We're finally realizing how they obtained the spy warrant on Carter Page, the campaign, and everything.
And there was actually, I just want to go right off of what Chuck said right here. There was actually such a big struggle, and I remember this clearly because I reported it on Fox when it happened that night, that they were threatening to subpoena the DOJ. It was like, either you turn over these documents or you're going to be in contempt. We're going to find you in contempt. And when that struggle came about, I mean, boy, there were phone calls being made that night, back and forth chatter. Finally, the DOJ relented relented, they gave in, they turned over the documentation. And remember, Chairman Nunes was actually almost like, I call it congressional arrest. He was almost like in a congressional prison for 8 months. They wouldn't let him work on this. They wouldn't let him focus on this. Now we've got Senator Grassley, and I think, Andy, Senator Grassley is right over the target with this criminal referral memo and exposure of what happened there with Christopher Steele and all those connections. So this was a big fight to get to the truth.
Now, on the issue of collusion, you're the moderator, but we're going to ask you a question anyway. You hear this said all over the time in terms of the idea of Trump and the Russians colluding to influence the election. You hear it all the time. There's no evidence of collusion, no evidence of collusion. The one piece of evidence that's probably the most troubling that you have to deal with is this June meeting in Trump Tower, where the Russians, working through a British music promoter, send this note to Donald Trump Jr. and say, we got some dirt on Hillary Clinton. And it's part of our campaign to help your father. I mean, it was just an astonishingly written note. And he meets with him. And these were people who were part of an anti-Magnitsky Act campaign. We know all that. And it came to nothing. But they did send him that letter, and they got the meeting. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I guess two things. First, just strictly as a lawyer looking at this in terms of criminal exposure, because this is supposed to be a now quasi-criminal investigation, even though it occurs under the guise of counterintelligence, right? If you think about what the original theory of collusion was, it was that the Russians hacked the election and that Trump and the Trump campaign somehow aided and abetted that effort knowingly. And that was something that was deemed to be so serious that even though there was scant evidence of it, we had to have an investigation of that. Now,
and you're referring to the DNC hack and the John Podesta.
Correct, right. So if I'm the Trump people, as bad as the meeting looks, and it's not a good meeting, I mean, I think it's an exhibition of poor judgment to take that meeting, stipulate that. But if they have to bring you the dirt on Hillary under those circumstances, then that blows up the original theory of collusion, which is that the campaign, the Trump campaign, and the Russians were actually in a conspiracy where there would have been no reason for Don Jr. to be taking a meeting in Trump Tower because that pipeline of information would already have been wide open.
Well, there was an introductory field to the email that is sent to Don Jr. Hi, we're the Russians. We want to collude with you.
Right.
There's a very sort of introductory knocking on the door sort of feel that you wouldn't have if there had been some pre-existing.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. But the other thing, let me just make one more point about it. The other thing I think this underscores, because there's a lot of this, not only the peculiar way that letter is worded, but the information, for example, in the Steele dossier, some of which you read and it just sounds so preposterous that
right.
you get the thought, and I think it's one that if I were investigating this, I'd be at least looking into, did they think they had an open channel into our intelligence community in which they could feed disinformation? And this goes to the other question, which is the whole collusion narrative is about the assumption that Russia wanted Trump to win. And it seems to me, even looking at Mueller's indictment against the Russians that he
Yes.
filed a week ago, that the obvious thing that happened here is Putin didn't want Trump to win. Putin wanted to sow discord in American society and the American political system. And the way he did that was not to support the guy he thought was going to win, but actually to support the factions he thought were going to lose, in the sense that by stirring them up, that is what creates the agitation and the dissension in the
And
the
Trump
system.
only became the vehicle of that, according to the indictment, in April of 2016, when it becomes clear that he's going to win the Republican nomination.
Right.
Before that, there was support of other people like Bernie Sanders or Jill Stein in an effort to sow that discord you were talking about.
Right.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I want, especially in my work, uncovering and working in intelligence and national security stories, I mean, this is what Russia was known for. I mean, they sowed discord and chaos. There was no evidence at any point that Vladimir Putin thought Trump would make the perfect president. He wasn't looking for that. In fact, I think he would have been perfectly happy. He understood how Hillary Clinton operated, and he was very familiar with her. He was not familiar at all with President Trump. And in fact, according to a number of Russian analysts, experts that were working at that time and looking at what was going on, there was a ton of calls going back and forth between Moscow and the embassy here in Washington, D.C., where they just didn't understand who this guy was. Who is this Trump guy? They didn't think he was going to win. How is he going to operate with us? How is he going to work with us on this? Look, the Russians in the end wanted to sow discord and chaos. And it appeared that the mainstream media, not everyone, but a lot of people in the media, even people within the Democratic Party, and maybe even some Republicans, fed into that. As somebody said to me in the intelligence community, the best asset the Russians had was some people within the United States that didn't know they were being played.
Yeah.
What about that? Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to jump back to the.
Yeah, please.
That's a good point. When we talk about the Trump Tower meeting as well, I think it's worth mentioning that there, the Fusion GPS, the firm behind the dossier, there's so many interesting coincidences, if that's what you want to call them, between Fusion GPS and their work on the dossier. Two of the attendees in that meeting happened to be working with Glenn Simpson at Fusion GPS. Glenn Simpson, he says that he had no idea about the Trump Tower meeting, that there was no way that bled back through into the dossier.
Right.
But it's
now just to be clear on that, this is Simpson has a meeting with the Russian lawyer before she meets at Trump Tower and then right after.
Yeah, it's just the strangest coincidence of this entire saga.
And I think when he gets asked about that, he is otherwise one of the most knowledgeable guys that you've ever heard, and he says, gee, I don't speak Russian.
Right.
I wasn't able to help you out with that.
Yeah, and it's several other coincidences that have popped up that have not really received much attention in the mainstream press, such as that DOJ official Bruce Orr was meeting with Glenn Simpson after the election. Bruce Orr's wife, Nellie, worked for Fusion GPS to research Trump. So, and that jumps over to post-election, what happened with this whole, getting back to the deep state question. It's a loaded term, obviously, it's a controversial term, but I don't really know how else to describe when you have Justice Department officials, State Department officials, the media even handling this document, using Steele's uncorroborated information to generate an investigation. There are a lot of activity behind the scenes at the top levels of the government.
We have a few minutes left. We should probably turn to what we think is coming up of relevance in the next few weeks. I think we not only have the Democratic answer to the Nunes memo coming up soon, very soon. We have an IG investigation at the Justice Department, which I think will mainly look into the FBI's activities in connection with the Clinton emails investigation, but who knows what else it'll bleed into. Byron, what do you think is important coming up?
Well, first, a word on that Inspector General investigation. I've had a lot of people say, well, that's going to be the big thing. We're going to find out when he releases it in April or May, whatever. And it is an investigation into the FBI's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. God knows there's a lot to look into there. The sort of pre-clearance, pre-exoneration they did before she was sort of formally exonerated on July 5th of 2016, and then the decision on October 28th to announce that you're reopening it, and then on November 6th, 2 days before the election, to say you found nothing, never mind. I mean, it's an astonishingly, in my view, mishandled investigation. So there's a lot to do there. But the fact is, the two investigations, Clinton email and Trump Russia, do begin to overlap and bleed into each other, not only because some of the same people are involved, and this whole Peter Strzok thing, the FBI agent who had the anti-Trump text with his paramour at the FBI, Lisa Page, another high-ranking FBI lawyer. the same people are involved with this, and I think that we can't help but learn a little bit about Trump-Russia when this report finally comes out.
Sarah?
Well, I agree with, right here with Byron, that the IG report's going to be important. I think also that it's going to show the expanse of the investigation. Remember, because part of the overview for Michael Horowitz and his investigation is also going to be former Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, and they're going to be focused very much on him as well. So we'll get a lot of information coming out there.
Why don't you just explicate a little bit about who he is and why he's relevant?
Oh, he's extraordinarily relevant because Deputy Director Andrew McCabe has been at the center of all of this controversy. He's under actually 3 last year, and we reported on this, 3 federal inquiries into him, Hatch Act violations. And this is separate from all of the involvement, but it was Hatch Act, whether or not he reported his wife's financial donations during her unsuccessful run for Virginia State Senate, which was close to $750,000 from PACs connected to Hillary Clinton, people that were connected to Terry McAuliffe and then friends of Hillary Clinton. So there were a lot of connections, there were a lot of political connections. There was also a sexual discrimination suit that was filed against him. But he was directly involved. He oversaw a lot of these investigations, and he was very politically motivated. It appeared that he definitely leaned towards Hillary Clinton. There's an investigation ongoing right now into leaks. Remember, there's 27 leak investigations. Right. The FBI, I know, has been conducting polygraphs on people within the FBI. I mean, the buck stops here, right, at the boss. So you had Comey and then Deputy Director McCabe, who's now been removed. So I think a lot of information will be coming out on him and his involvement in the 302s. Remember, these are the witness interviews Peter Strzok conducted. And I don't want anybody to forget about those investigations into leaks, because the leak investigations that are ongoing right now at the Department of Justice, I think, will also be significant. And of course, we don't want to forget that Devin Nunes is in the phase 2 of their own investigation and have basically sent out the questions, 10 questions, to former senior Obama officials asking what their knowledge was of the dossier. And this is going to be very important because they could choose not to answer these questions, but then they will be subpoenaed, I've been told, if they refuse to do that. 3 of them we know so far. They should answer. They should answer. Is former CIA Director John Brennan. Yeah. See a lot of fans out here of Brennan.
Don't boo Brennan. It's subpoenaing Brennan.
Subpoenaing. And everyone's favorite, former FBI Director James Comey. and James Clapper. So we know that for sure.
Well, let me get Chuck in here about this whole idea of the comparison of the 2 investigations, because the way this has been reported, Byron's talking about how they actually do bleed into each other, but most of the reporting treats one in a vacuum and the other in the vacuum. So it doesn't seem to occur to people that, you know, in the Mueller investigation, if you lie to the FBI, that actually gets treated like a felony. They prosecute you. In the Clinton investigation, if you lied to the FBI, they basically thanked you for playing and gave you a prize, and let you go merrily along, probably with immunity from prosecution. What about the idea of considering them in tandem?
Yeah, well, speaking to the disparate outcomes on lying to the FBI, I did a little bit of reporting on Peter Strzok, interviewed Michael Flynn, as we all know. Flynn allegedly lied during that interview about contacts with Russia's ambassador. Strzok was also on the Clinton investigation, conducted the interviews, led the interviews with Hillary Clinton herself, all of her aides, Huma Abedin, Cheryl Mills. Going back through the 302s, which are the summaries of those interviews, we saw that Abedin and Mills essentially gave misleading statements. I don't know if you want to call them lies at this point, but about what they knew of Hillary's server during the State Department days. So, and if you compare their email traffic from several years ago, you can establish this. Now, nothing happened to Abbott and Mills, as we all know, whereas Flynn
Yet.
Well, yeah, that could come out maybe. But so it's interesting to see how the two investigations have been treated differently, and especially when you look at Flynn, the underlying conduct was not illegal. I mean, he was having a conversation with a diplomat. So.
One last thing, I think we didn't get around much to what Mueller is doing and these indictments that were in the news and guilty pleas and everything. I think the one thing that's striking is that he has indicted a bunch of people, some people pleaded guilty, there have been a whole lot of counts, and if you look at the idea, if you accept the idea that there was a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russians to influence the election, he hasn't charged anybody with being a part of it yet. Andy has written about this better than anybody else from a former prosecutor's perspective, but that hasn't happened yet. I'm not saying it's not going to happen because I don't know the future, but we've gone a pretty long way and they haven't charged it yet.
I'm afraid we're getting the hook here, and I'm sorry about that because we could talk about this for hours. It's been an honor to be on a panel with this depth of knowledge, and thank you all for coming and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you.